All right, it is sending it to live. All right, and we are running live. So I want to welcome everyone to our walking tour. I apologize if anyone tried the other link and wasn't able to get with us. We had a little technical difficulty. But I'm Brad Richardson. I'm here from the Clark County Historical Museum, and this year we are doing our virtual walking tours. And today we are doing a tour of Esther Short Park neighborhood, and we are lucky enough to have Vancouver and Clark County historian Pat Gelada joining us today for the tour. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started with our tour and talk about this first site, which is the Slocum House, which was built in 1877 by Charles and Laura Slocum. So Pat, tell us a little bit about the history of the Slocum House.
Oh my goodness, there's so much. It's a most unique house. It was moved here just a block away from its original site. In the 60s, we had this disease sweep across the United States they called urban renewal, and whole neighborhoods were bulldozed. A group of citizens tried very hard to save the houses, at least some of the houses, because they're magnificent houses like this one. This is the only one they were able to save, and it was moved into the park. Widows Walk, very northeastern United States, and it's you can almost smell the Atlantic Ocean from the Widows Walk. Charles Slocum came here to conduct business with the Army. He was what was called a hustler, and he became a very successful businessman, investing in early Vancouver. He, as we discussed, he laid out the plat for the city of Boise, Idaho, which I think is just a wonderful side note that connects Vancouver with other places. And then, of course, the house became a theater for a long time. And then the theater left, and there's been other uses since then.
And the theater was led by Hermine Decker Duthie, who she was a local historian. She worked with the Historical Society. She was an instructor at Clark College, right? And she has quite a colorful background. So talk a little bit about what you know about Hermine.
Oh my goodness. Well, I know she dated Edward R. Murrow. Hermine was really our photography person. As you go through the photography collection, you'll see on the back, reject by Hermine Decker, as she copied our photograph collection. She would come in every week and work on that. She taught at Clark College, yes. She wrote a play about Esther Short. She was indeed a very colorful character.
And the other thing too is when the Slocum House Theater was in there, it had some other stories beyond the theater stories that popped up. So there's been like other worldly stories, right?
Oh yes, the ghosts of the Slocum House. Several, as a matter of fact. There was a lady in white on the staircase. There was a figure, a man seen in the wardrobe room, and another shadowy figure in the green room. I've never found anything that happened bad in that house. And of course, Charles Slocum had sold it and built a bigger house when they thought the center of town was going to move to the railroad tracks. Several leading people.
Which that's not a bet I would have made, right? Because we're looking at what's historically always been the heart of Vancouver, right? And the reason for that is Esther Short. So we're actually walking past Esther Short Park. So tell us a little bit about Esther Short and her story.
Esther Short. Esther and Amos started out in Pennsylvania. They left Pennsylvania, headed west, wound up in Missouri, Amos was always looking for that brass ring, always looking to make his fortune. Eventually, each time they stopped, they'd have another child. They finally wound up here and settled on a claim that was owned by someone else, Henry Williamson. And the Amos or Esther by this time had 10 children. She stood fast. Amos was drowned. That's a good half-hour talk just about Esther Short. But in her will, she left this section of land to be a park, a public plaza, such as they had in Pennsylvania forever, and disinherited 9 of her 10 children. So we wound up in court, and that was part of one of the many reasons that Vancouver did not grow, because the land was tied up in the courts. And of course, the Propstra Tower and Propstra Square.
So tell us a little bit, why is this specific part of the park called Propstra? And what's the story behind how this came to be and who was involved?
Oh my goodness, everybody was involved. George Propstra, of course, was the gentleman who founded Burgerville and the Holland Restaurant, a philanthropist, larger than life fellow. And we're going to have this Propstra Square, which is, by the way, bigger than Pioneer Square in Portland. You can't do it because it's surrounded by trees. It doesn't look like it. But he wanted a tower. He wanted a clock tower. And the city came up with this wooden structure like the fort. You know, it had the like the bastion of the fort, and he hated it. He did not want it wood. He was tired of the fort. He did not want the fort. He wanted something, in his words, I want something cute. Well, what's cute, George? Well, you'll know it when you see it. You know, in Europe, you go into the square and there's a tower and it's cute. And that's what I want, cute. And we would meet Wednesday mornings at his house on the Evergreen Highway, and we would talk about cute. And when one day we began talking about the legend of the salmon, the Chinook, reverence for the salmon, that the salmon were actually people who live in the sea. And once a year, they will come up the river to see how man is doing. And you catch the first salmon, it's carried with great ceremony to the campsite, to the village. It's never cut crosswise, always lengthwise. Everyone feasts. What's left over is taken back to the river, put in the river with the head pointing toward the sea, so that salmon can go back and tell his fellows that he was treated with respect. And if we didn't, they wouldn't come back the next year. The bells, by the way, were donated, the carillon and the bells were donated by Paul Christensen, another philanthropist and businessman of Vancouver.
And it was Paul and George and some other people from the city of Vancouver that really, what we see today with Esther Short Park, they made that happen, right? There was a couple. Who were the 2 people that kind of helped with that with the city?
Oh my gosh, there were so many. There were really John Fishbach, Royce Pollard, Donnie Propstra, who is a psychologist in San Francisco, came up every week. Every week he would fly up to work on this tower with his father. And it was his architect that designed it. And when they designed it, George said, now that's cute. The Gemco building, the brick building we're looking at with the odd windows, that was built right after the end of World War II. And building materials were short. And if you walk in there, there's these big wooden pillars holding it up. And those were from the mast from the battleship Oregon. Rest of the battleship is in Waterfront Park. Not the rest of it, a lot of it. But the masts are the pillars in that building, which I think is unique.
That's incredible, because you hear about those stories of buildings and things being reused in different buildings, but to actually know where something's at like that is always just incredibly fascinating. And then we just passed the heart, right, of Vancouver, and you had a part in that also.
Well, yeah, I'm one of the women. It was for the women of the heart of Vancouver, the women who, and they chose me to be one of them that was put there. And it was kind of fun to be a part of that, be a part of the celebration, and to bring more art to downtown. We have an incredible collection of what I call whimsical art downtown. I think that's what we should be really talking more about, is the windmill and the movie camera, all of these things, the murals. We have just a great collection of whimsical art that we should be very proud of.
And then if we're talking about kind of whimsical buildings, we have we have the Smith Tower. So tell us a little bit about the history of this building.
Well, it was built as a residence for low-income senior citizens. Now it still is for seniors. Some people called it the beer can that Lucky Lager beer came in.
I think
right across from the brewery.
I think someone even had suggested when they were talking about tearing the brewery down that they should have put the Lucky Lager sign on top of it because it looks like a beer can, right?
Oh, wouldn't that have been a great idea? Oh, I'll bet the FAA would have had a fit.
And this is interesting because this was built in 1966. So this is right around that urban renewal period. So you are getting Vancouver that's looking during this time, it's looking for a new identity to some degree, because it is taking a lot of, like you said, a lot of those historic homes were removed, historic buildings were removed, and then this structure was created. And what people see here often, they either, I think it's a love it or hate it building, to be honest. But I think you have to look at that this is a really clear representation of what the national move, because Rudy Lupke was the mayor kind of during this period, and he went out to national conferences and was really examining what was the sense of urban renewal in towns across the nation. And obviously urban renewal has a very complicated and complex, we don't want to underscore how complex and also how difficult that history is when we talk about that term urban renewal. And this is an interesting piece to have in our downtown, because it allows us to have a physical representation of that conversation that we could have, even that we have yet to really have historically, I think locally, about what did urban renewal really mean in Vancouver and in downtown especially.
And this building, the Plaid Pantry, was always known as the building with the upside down sign. This day and night market, I guess they originally installed it accidentally and then just left it. And it was always something that you always knew you were here. Besides the Smith Tower, because all of those people that were uprooted from their homes in that residential area, the Vancouver Housing Authority built at Andreessen and roughly Mill Plain, they built the low-income housing there. And so the residents moved out. Downtown said, hey, where are all our customers? So it really contributed to our long-term fading of downtown, was losing all those customers downtown, just kind of making downtown sterile. The other was, I think, changing zoning so that you couldn't live over the store.
Mm-hmm. And it is, and it really did change the character of the downtown area. And then if we look here, you see this little building on the very far corner. That's the Du Bois Motor Company. It was built around 1927, and it ended up being a part of a regional car dealership that was started by the Du Bois family. And they're prominent, right? Tell us a little bit about the Du Bois family.
Goodness, the Du Boises, they did everything. They did everything. They were in politics. They were in business. Lloyd Du Bois began a newspaper, the Chronicle. Name an office, and Lloyd Du Bois was in. He's on the school board. He was a volunteer fireman. No matter what you looked at, the Du Bois family was involved in that. And new businesses that would take a little bit of a risk, like motor cars or like a newspaper. The Chronicle didn't last long, unfortunately, but the Du Bois family, we have, then again, the Du Bois neighborhood.
Yeah.
So still having an impact.
And we just did so that building specifically is one we're working on getting on the register,
Oh,
the
wonderful.
historical register. And what we did is we did a survey, and you're kind of looking at Washington here right now, and we can see all these buildings, and we see the new construction, and we see the Du Bois building. But what we found when we did this survey is we looked at the directories, and stretching from 4th all the way to 9th on Washington around 1909 into the 1940s was actually
Oh,
this like automotive sales corridor.
yes, yes. You can stand on or you could stand on the overpass for the railroad and just see. Well, even before the automobile, it was livery stables and that sort of thing. And then automobiles came in, and it was auto parts, garages, stores. We'll get to the Marshall Building later. All of the whole thing. That's because that's when you came off the bridge. That's where you came off. You came off on Washington Street.
And you know what, we with that research, and this is the fun thing I think that you see as you're being a historian and working on these things, is we've actually started in our terminology to coin this as the early Washington Street automotive sales district, because
Yes.
it really was this sales district. And the first one that we found was oh my gosh, what was his name? Oh, now it's completely escaping me, but there was a gentleman that actually started in 1909 with one of the first Moss. That's Clyde J.
Yeah.
Moss, and
Yes.
he sold cars, bikes, and sporting goods, and that was a big deal at that time. And
he kept the weather records for 65 years.
and the other cool thing is right in the middle of this automotive district, we're looking right now at this new construction, but what used to stand here in the middle of this district was the brewery. So talk a little bit about the brewery history that's so important to these blocks right here.
Oh my goodness. The breweries go back to Henry Weinhardt at that location. There were natural springs with very, very good water there, which is why the brewery was originally built there. Because Weinhardt's, then it became Star, Hop Gold, and eventually, of course, what everyone remembers, Lucky Lager. And then that was bought out by a European company and abandoned. And it was a derelict building in the heart of town, and again contributed to the slow death of downtown to have this derelict building. And we were having people homeless camping in there. There were small fires. What really set the council off, the city council off, was he'd done this to other breweries. And one in St. Louis, a child had climbed into the brewery tower and had fallen and wasn't found for several days. And we could not legally buy the building that way. But because the springs were there, we could invest from the water sewer fund and use that money to preserve the spring. There are springs all over downtown, actually. And sometimes in Esther Short Park, you will, where the high-end seating is for the concerts, that ground will be mushy because there's a spring there. But we were able to take that brewery down before it burned or before someone was seriously injured. And the blocks all around it were also part of that purchase.
And it's just such an interesting entire district along Washington Street, because you had the brewery, you had this automotive piece, and then you also had the streetcar. And actually this building here is we call it the Sedgwick building. It's known as Murray's Corner locally. And this was built, I think around like about 1909, 1910. And we know it was built by Isabel Sedgwick, who was an early physician in Vancouver. And that's a history that's really, this year we're getting to unpack quite a bit, is the history that women have had in Vancouver, which has been significant. And Isabel actually, she grew this business as a physician. She was actually born in 1871 in Iowa and moved to Vancouver in the 1880s. And after finishing school, she was able to actually attend the University of Oregon. And that's where she got her medical training. And in the spring of 1909, Isabel had established her medical practice in Vancouver and accumulated enough wealth that she was able to construct this building right here for $15,000, which, inflated would have been about 400,000 total to do that. And
Yes.
eventually, by a couple years later, she actually tried to apply for the streetcar franchise, and she ended up being pushed out of that and wasn't able to. And so she eventually moved on and left this building. But then it became Murray's Corner. So a little bit about the
With
Murray.
Murray's Cafe, yeah, Murray's Cafe. He changed it from Murray's Cafe to Murray's Lunch. Carl Murray, grandfather of Gene Murray, I think still is around. And then all of a sudden, a lot of other cafes started opening up. So he changed the name from Cafe to Murray's Lunch. And then Murray's, after Murray's Cafe and Bar, Tavern. But we still, yes, call it Murray's Corner.
And it's interesting.
And boarding rooms. There were supposed to be boarding rooms upstairs, and they're still able to have the residential part.
And then off to the left, we have Block 10, and you know a little bit about that block, right?
Yeah. Oh, there were so many businesses there, and the brewery bought it and took them all out, so it was employee parking. And when the city bought the brewery, they bought this building and also the buildings along 6th Street, along 8th Street. What are we going to do with this? But there have been so many proposals about this block. Kaiser Permanente talked about having their headquarters there, and there was finally the downtown people kind of made it sort of park-ish, but not quite a park, but park-ish, so that it would be attractive and not, but not something that couldn't be easily taken down.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that whole history again ties to those brewery blocks because they thought they were going to expand it, and even the block over where the Starbucks is at was also supposed to be part of that.
Yes. That whole, isn't this an incredible building? I think Carl Mason still owns this building.
And now we're coming up on a very interesting building, especially for us as historians. This is the Rank building. So this was built by Glenn Rank, and the date is around 1909 that it was built. And tell us a little bit about Glenn Rank and what his significance is to our story.
Oh, good heavens. Yes, he is our hero. He was the city historian. Glenn was an engineer. He was a lot of things, but to me, the most important thing is his love of history. He wrote a book about the history of Vancouver. Oh, he wrote one wonderful story about Ira Cressup, the sheriff, who was chasing a bank robber. A guy had held up the streetcar. What a loser, pulling up a streetcar. And he's chasing him on Capitol Hill. And the guy turned around and fired a gun at Ira, and it bounced off his elk's pin and hit him in the neck. And Ira whipped out his handkerchief, tied it around his neck, continued to give chase. And that was a story that Glenn wrote that still you can feel it. And he was, we used to have East B and West B, East C, West C. We had all lettered streets, East and West. Very confusing to some researchers. For instance, the brewery was on West C, and we know C Street, so they thought that the brewery had moved, and it wasn't. It was just that Glenn Rank renamed all those lettered streets, the alphabetical streets, and he named them in alphabetical order: Columbia, Daniels, Esther, Franklin, Grant, Harney. Named them all in all in alphabetical order and all over people that were historically important. So Glenn is a fascinating man. And president of started the Historical Society, was involved in moving the Covington House. What am I forgetting? Just he did so many things.
His Camas connection.
Oh, and he was connected everywhere.
Yep. He had a store that he started out in Camas, and he sold it to a to Charles Farrell, and that's where the Farrell store started. And then eventually today we have the Farrell building in downtown Camas, but
Yeah,
Glenn Rank owned that building, or owned not that building, but had a store at that spot, and eventually sold before he ended up coming and laying roots down in Vancouver. And here we see a very important building related to automotive history. Again, this had Bill Marshall Ford and other things, right?
that's right. It was Grandy Ford. Bill Marshall was gracious enough to take the owners of the present owners of the building and I through the building and talk about it. During the war, when the war came, they could sell used cars, and they kept going by doing auto repair because you had to keep repairing these cars. Bill was a bomber pilot. I'm sorry, a fighter pilot during World War II. When he came back, his job was still there at Grandy Ford, and eventually he bought in a partnership. It became Grandy and Marshall, and eventually Marshall Ford. The building was also called the Marine Building because the United States Steamship Company had its headquarters there. And that was people like Erskine Scott Wood and Stan Bishoprick, lumber people who owned a fleet of ships. I think there were 42 of them, a large fleet of ships to transport lumber to Asia. And during the war, their ships were commandeered by the army or by the government. They lost several of them. Several of them were sunk. But it kind of an amusing story, not amusing. Marine company was going to put in a ladies' room. They had a men's room. Going to put in a ladies' room, and using the hot lead, it dropped down into the car dealership, into the paint shop, and set it on fire and burned off the second story of what is the Java House. And somewhere there is a film of that fire.
And the building we just passed where we saw like gravitate, that also has an interesting story related to the Copeland family, right?
The Copeland family sold furniture. Father, son, it was in the family for many, many years. There were two furniture stores in town. Keith Copeland told me once that they kind of lived off each other because different kinds of furniture, people would come over to Vancouver, look at Vancouver furniture, and then come over to Copeland's or vice versa. We're passing the telephone exchange building. Talk about that, Brad. Oh, we've lost, you're muted.
When we do the middleman one, we'll tease that for people that we're going to talk about that one, and we're going to show them a nice little historical hidden piece that they wouldn't know about until we actually show them. So we'll tease for a later tour for that for that one.
Yes, come back back for the next one.
So this one is a really important structure. So this is St. James Proto Cathedral, built in 1885. It's a Gothic revival style. So talk a little bit about the story of this one.
Well, this was the cathedral. We were the archdiocese. This was built. The small wooden church across from the mission was taken over by the army. There was a tremendous lawsuit, the army versus the Catholic Church. And they based it on British law as they pled their case, the army did, to eventually acquire that. And this building was built to replace that church and built as a cathedral. Well, the archdiocese moved to Seattle, but they could not remove the cathedral because the bishop was buried in the church. And they came down on a Sunday afternoon and they dug up the bishop and took him to Seattle so that they could be the cathedral. It's a beautiful church inside. It was for the Catholic community. This is the center of their town.
And this history, I mean, you stretches way back in the community. I mean, this church, the history of it goes really far back.
Oh, indeed. The fathers Blanchet came to minister to the and Dr. McLaughlin, in fact, converted to Catholicism on a Christmas Eve after the Catholic Church arrived.
And this is like you said, the second one that they had. And the interesting about this one is that it's believed that this church is modeled after one that was constructed in Belgium. That's what architect Donald McKay, Father Dillon of St. James, actually said they believe the plans might be similar to one that's in Belgium. And this is an interesting church because it was completed in 1885 and it's said to be built with hidden brick, just like many other structures, and that the actual cost of the church is unknown, but an article from 1884 in the Central newspaper reported that the construction would have been about $27,000 at the time, which is just amazing. And it didn't have these other buildings around it at the time. It had, for a short period of time, right, it had a cemetery, and there's a history that's important to know related to that, right?
Yes, because when of course, a whole story of cemeteries. When the army closed the city's cemetery that had belonged to St. James, townspeople and military and the church had been buried there. And they began to bury here, and then they bought St. James Acres and began to move the bodies there. And you want the story of
Yep.
Yes. The St. James Acres, it's now Mother Joseph Cemetery. They got into a disagreement about boundary and fence lines. So they brought in a surveyor to lay out the property lines of the cemetery. And they found, to their horror, that there were two dedicated city streets running through the cemetery. Never built on, of course, people were buried there. But they came to the city council when I was on the council, and they asked that we vacate those streets and not charge assessed valuation. And we, of course, agreed and sold it to them, the land to them, for $1. And then I asked, who's buried at the crossroads? There where the streets cross, who's there? And it's Mayor John P. Kiggins, buried at the crossroads to keep him from running for office again.
So here we see the post office, and this is interesting because from what we know, the cornerstone was laid for this in 1917. And the story that I've been told was that it was big fanfare. People came out and they were really excited about this, but its thunder was stolen very quickly because the interstate bridge would open not too long after this. So people were like, the post office is great, but it wasn't there. So the built date we have for this is 1918. And this is, believed to be kind of a classical style structure that's here. It's kind of neoclassical is what it's often referred to. And this is just an interesting note. So talk a little bit about the post office history that you know.
Well, this is the first federally funded post office in Clark County. The others were in stores. People would build their own, have the post office in their house. This was the first one that was actually paid for by the federal government. And to make it more self-sustaining, of course, the second floor is office space that's rented out. So it's
really?
Yes. I miss the trees around it, though. I really do. We used to have some glorious old trees, but we need parking.
And one of the things that we found when we were doing our research for the Du Bois building is that there was a post office that actually sat where that building is at today. And it was Hattie Dennison, I'm just remembering it off the top of my head, was the postmaster at the building at that time. And from what we could tell, she was most likely the first woman postmaster in Washington Territory. So it's funny with Vancouver, we have a lot of these really interesting stories in relation to basically every bill. You could throw a stone and find history that's pretty significant to Washington State.
Absolutely. And people, the families we're all close together as well. The Hiddens and the Du Bois, and all of these people, all within this small area. Just they all married each other, just.
And what's interesting is we walk past here, and actually, this is just off the top of my head because I've been looking at the maps a lot recently because I'm teaching these online property research classes, and the couple houses, the one that's called the Centennial House and the other house that's back there, plus these ones, were part of a cluster of a few more residential homes, but a little bit to where the post office is at and those streets are located, if I'm remembering correctly, was actually some I think it was a Catholic college and different
Holy Angels
institutions.
College, yes.
I believe I think that's what was there. And it's just interesting to think about how there were these complexes that kind of developed of different things, and how these institutions like we had. Talk a little bit about that college, because we had a college here.
We had a college here, Catholic college. That's what brought Patty Houck to Vancouver. He came to teach at Holy Angels. And when they built the rectory, not of hidden brick, that one they brought the bricks in from Portland. I don't know what that disagreement was about. And then Holy Angels. So when they wanted to punch Columbia Street through, they couldn't because the college and the rectory. So you've got a jog right there around the rectory.
And that northern piece of the jog used to be called Park.
Yes.
Which is just, and that's just, historians love it when you change the names and numbers on streets because it makes it so easy for us to figure it out, right?
Yes, it does indeed. Here is I think that this is a classic of its style of architecture. Don't you talk? Because I love, you pointed out they painted the strips darker brown, and that's lovely. You're muted again.
Look at that. There I am. I'm back. They did paint between the windows brown recently. And this is obviously the Clark County Courthouse. It was built in 1941. And this is actually the fourth courthouse. And prominent architect Day Hilborn actually designed this around 1940. And this was actually toward the middle of his career. So Hilborn, he started all the way back in the 20s in Vancouver. And his first substantial building, which we'll talk about on the Middle Main one, is that medical arts building that's in downtown. And you and I know that by name, but many people probably don't. So we'll just kind of leave them guessing right now on that. But then from there, he was doing Beaux-Arts style, and he went from that to then do the Kiggins Theater, which was obviously trending towards Art Deco and Art Deco style. And then by the 40s, he was doing more modern stuff. This is still Art Deco elements and modern elements to it.
Especially in the interior.
Yeah, absolutely. And the windows, the way that those are done. And then when you walk around to the side, you also see how Clark County is designed. But then he goes later in his career and he does this, what's called ultra modern style, which is the Chase Bank that's up today, which was the Vancouver Federal Savings and Loan. And the courthouse history, the courthouse has resided, not the entire history, because there was the original courthouse that was around 1855 when the county was just a couple years old. And during those first years, the commissioners actually would meet in the private home of probate judge Amos Short, from what our records tell us, yes, and in Hudson's Bay Company buildings. And the first courthouse was actually completed in October 1st of 1855 at a cost of, brace yourselves, they spent a whole $440 on this courthouse. Wow. So it was a frame structure that was said to be 30 by 45 feet with 2 stories. And it was known as the Red Barn. And it was located at 9th and Reserve. And then about 3 years later, they constructed a jail, and it was made of logs, and it was referred to as the Log Hut. So we had the Red Barn and the Log Hut for our, judicial system. And it was during 1882 that a decision was made to build a new courthouse. And the townspeople, they objected to the use of the Red Barn and the Log Hut. And so this was, the second courthouse was completed around 1883. And this was a wonderful structure. It was on 11th and Franklin. So it was finally when they brought it to this site here. And it cost $44,500 to build that. And it was described, quote, elegantly fitted with all the accessories calculated to add to the comfort of the public. The rooms were lofty, well proportioned, airy, and conveniently arranged. It was a 3 stories. Yeah, and flammable because unfortunately in 1890 the thing burns to the ground, and so they're left with having to do another one. So they built another very grand structure. It was a really nice one, and this one stood for 50 years until finally they realized they were bursting at the seams and they needed to build this one. So it's just, so other than that period of the Reserve Street courthouse, the courthouse has resided on this location for most of its history. Is there anything else about kind of the courthouse or anything?
Well, I think we should. There's a tree blocking our view of it now, but the brigade sculpture over the front door.
Hmm.
It was originally of concrete, I believe, and
Hmm.
when they were steam cleaning, blasting, trying to clean the courthouse prior to painting, they essentially destroyed the sculpture. So they
Mm.
just removed it. Townspeople were upset with that. So a drive was on to replace the brigade. That's Lewis and Clark, uh, and so it was done in bronze uh,
Hmm.
and was remounted over the door. So the sculpture is back and permanent now.
And it's so interesting to look at these blocks as we walk through, because you see this, you see a modern building to our left right here, which is the Robert L. Harris Juvenile Center. And then you have like these older buildings, like the Franklin building to our right. But then all of a sudden you see these houses starting to develop, because I mean, this was a mixed area where you had these kind of government entities, commercial buildings, and houses all intermixed. And Vancouver just kind of like picked little pockets over time of development to change. So, it's just fascinating. And then one of the buildings that we looked back, it's way back there, it had a big, thick block to it. I think that I always speculate that building is Rothler block, which is that block that was really made prominent by John Rothler, who was a Camas builder and designer. And so, there was a lot of also uh, communication and work between all these communities. They weren't in vacuums,
That's
aside from
right.
each other.
Yes.
And we're coming up here into a nice cluster of residential. We can see a little peak just starting to peek over those trees. Tell us a little bit. What is that house? Is the Charles Brown House. It's named after its most prominent or infamous resident, and it was built in 1866, and it's said to be a Second Empire West Coast style house. Talk a little bit about the story behind this house.
Oh, Charles Brown was a most influential man. He had been county auditor. He was president of the bank, the wonderful bank that's downtown, that's now a glass studio. That was where his bank was. And this was his home where he lived with his wife, Ada, and their children. And a bank examiner came to the bank, and there had been some questionable loans. The bank was closed by the bank examiner. Charles Brown tapped the manager. And they left the bank together, walked to this house, looked in the window where his wife and children were sitting by the fireplace, looked in the windows at them, stopped by a park where the manager's children should have been playing. They continued walking and walking into the night until almost to 39th Street. They walked. And there they sat down, and manager, Charles Brown shot the manager in the head and then shot himself to death.
Wow.
They could not face the shame, I imagine, was the reason. After
Mhm.
having been so prominent, so respected, to have the bank closed and was possibly criminal charges.
Mhm.
The manager had run into him and said, "We are undone."
And it's just, and that's the story of that. It has, people think of these kind of local stories, but it has this broader tie, because part of the speculation, people who have looked at this moment have examined that the depression of 1892-93 that took a lot of banks kind of initiated what Brown and Canby potentially did later. And so, we always think of our kind of hometown or local stories, but having that national context and realizing there were these real world repercussions that now are still tied to these structures is always fascinating. And then beyond that, there's a lot of stuff related to Lincoln in this house, because Samuel Brown, who was Charles's father, who actually outlived him, and his house is, you know, stone's throw down from here. It's actually the old Hamilton Milan funeral home.
Yes.
Samuel Brown is believed to have potentially have served in the Illinois legislature with Abraham Lincoln, and actually came out here and worked at the land office as a Lincoln appointee, right?
Yes. Yes. Again and again, we find that Vancouver has connections to much broader, wider stories than just us.
And it's funny because you have for years basically been tilling this very fertile historical soil that people haven't examined, and you've just been, and one after another, you pick up and find these stories. And here's just another one that's interesting in the sense that this is the Kettering House. This was built around 1908, and this is a Craftsman or box, classic box with Craftsman details is what it says. And Fred Kettering actually came to Vancouver around 1901 when he was 26 years old, with a degree in civil engineering from Cornell College in Iowa. And he migrated west to take charge of construction of the Great Northern Railway's new line from Portland to Yakima. And the line was never completed. However, because of different things that happened, the Yakult burn and other stuff happened around that time. But later, he would own a sawmill on the East Fork of the Lewis River. And that's when he built this home. And it's noted, and I believe it's correct, that one daughter of his, Margaret, married George Propstra. I believe
Yes.
that's correct.
Yes.
So it's just, you know, in these families, like you said, they're very tied, and there's this kind of continuum that goes from one generation to another. And then, you know, as we look off to the right, we see that other big house that's off to the side. And that one is known as the Chumacero home. And that was built in 1903, but it wasn't here until 1930.
Right. They moved it
Yep.
just a block. In fact, that street, that it was Harney, it was on Harney. And at that time, they had actually named it Chumacero Street.
Mm-hmm.
Chumacero was our first Filipino inhabitant. And a fascinating story. His father had immigrated from the Philippines, had joined the Union Army during the Civil War, and was killed. Alfred Chumacero was taken in by his uncle, given a good, fine education, became a pharmacist, had the Chumacero drugstore, which is in the Schofield building downtown, which I'm sure we'll get into on Main Street.
Yep.
And married Mary White, I believe was her name, Mary. But he died very young of tuberculosis. A very sad, tragic end again. And here's a sad story. I was so disappointed.
So this building, this is the First Presbyterian, and this one is very interesting. It was built around 1912. It's said to be a Beaux-Arts, and if you get a chance to look, the architecture is amazing. And what is said is that the congregation actually started around 1882, and it was 8 men and 7 women that got together and formed the First Presbyterian, and that congregation still exists up on near 39th to this day. And the structure that they originally built in 1885, it cost about $4,000, and it said it was featured with white paint, a tall steeple, Gothic windows, and it could seat about 300 people. And just like so many of our stories, so reportedly in 1911, it burned to the ground, and it left them without a place to worship, right? So it was around 1912 that the congregation had amassed enough fundings for a new facility. And this church that you see right here was built with $27,000 with an additional $2,000 for pews. So we adjusted it a couple years for inflation. I think it was like 2014 when we did this. In 2014, it would have cost $700,000 to build this building, and it was dedicated on June 28th, 1912. And this is the part that I always love about this building. Is upon its completion, the church was touted by the Daily Columbian, which was the name of the Columbian at the time, as being the last word in church architecture. And they like to make grandiose comments like that, because when they talked about Day Hilborn's the Chase Bank building, which is the bank was the Vancouver Federal Savings and Loan, they said it was as modern as a rocket to the moon.
Oh,
So they had a really great way, the Columbian, of doing that. And we're lucky to still have the Columbian in the community, obviously, as a local owned newspaper. We have a local paper here, which is really cool. But yeah, this one. And then eventually the congregation did move out of this. And at one point, this was the Columbia Arts Center, right? And you know a little bit of story
yes,
behind that.
yes. It was the Columbia Art Center. The art gallery was downstairs. The theater was where the large window is. There was a stage and a performing arts center. It was not successful. That is also there's a ghost story there too of the Reverend Baskerville.
Mm.
The Reverend Baskerville, a hot summer afternoon, Sunday after services, he and the church organist, they took their family down to the river. His wife and daughters stepped out into the river to cool off, stepped into a hole, were swept away.
Mm.
The Reverend dove in the water to rescue them. They were rescued. He drowned.
Oh my gosh.
And while it was a theater, they would see the very sad gentleman trying to take care of the building. Baskerville's brother, whose first name has just gone out of my head, is highly revered in Iran.
Mm-hmm.
He took part in the rebellion, the Iranian rebellion, to oust the Shah,
Mm-hmm.
and was killed in that rebellion. And he's buried in Tehran, and it's almost a shrine to the Iranians. So, and I've said that, they don't know if it was ever sent, but they made a rug with his face in it, a Iranian rug, and just give his mother, who remained here. How terrible for her to lose two sons in such grotesque ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, just all those connections with those buildings, and again we see all of this neighborhood that has all these different styles of buildings, and we're coming up on another set of houses again. And one of the houses that we're going to come up on is the Lloyd Du Bois house, because we were talking about the Du Bois family earlier, and I think I'm saying that right now. I think I'm saying the name correctly. So can you talk a little bit about Lloyd Du Bois and that family?
The Vancouver pronounces it Du Bois. I don't care what the French say. We say Du Bois. Again, on the Chronicle, involved in so many, but the family was just involved in lumber, involved in businesses.
Yeah, and this one is the Albert Blaker house, and Albert was a local politician. He had the Blaker building. He was very prominent. He still has family members in the community connected
yes,
to
the
that.
Blaker building was another one that burned at one time, and then was rebuilt.
Yep. And then this one we can see kind of behind the trees is that's the Lloyd Du Bois building.
It's another sad. We have so many sad, tragic stories, don't we?
We do, because that one you found a specific story related to it.
Yes, a grandmother with her two grandsons was renting the house from Du Bois after they moved on to a more luxurious home. And a hot summer day, and the two boys set off on their bikes to go exploring, and they made it up to Vancouver Junction on their bikes. And there was a train stopped at the junction. They actually got off their bikes to walk them across, being careful, walk them across the tracks. Unfortunately, on the second track, there was a train coming at high speed and struck the first little boy. And they brought his body back to this house where, in the style of the day, until the funeral, they laid his little coffin out in the living room, in the parlor. And that's when they began hearing little footsteps on the porch and trying the door, but there was never anyone there, just trying to get back home and never quite making it back into the house. Sad story.
I know that story always gets me when I hear it. And it's it's such a fascinating house because it has obviously these multiple stories. And if I'm recalling correctly, one of the neat ones we just found, because we're working on the women's history exhibit, is that I believe when women were able to vote in Vancouver and Clark County, that Miss Lloyd Du Bois was the first woman to register to vote. I believe that's in a news article. And what's fascinating about the Esther Short neighborhood, because we, this is our last site that we're looking at, is really just to think about the fact of how there are these little pockets of history throughout it, where you get these commercial buildings and you get these, you get federal buildings and government buildings and religious structures and homes and stuff that's just all through this entire neighborhood. And if you don't just kind of get out and look around and walk, you wouldn't realize they're there. And what we've been lucky is that we've had a lot of commercial businesses come in and use these as offices. And so, Pat, is there anything last you want to kind of make a comment about the Esther Short neighborhood as we're wrapping up?
As a wrapping up, uh, it we can see here how the town, these were houses were built by people that were making it. They were starting businesses. They were getting involved in how the town would be run, how the town would grow. They knew each other. They socialized together. They belonged to lodges together. Uh, the lodge life was very active here in Vancouver. So these people, this is a story of us, uh, the people that built this city. Uh, I we talked about the Blaker the houses. We give them the names of the families that lived in them, because those were the families that built the town, that built us, and this is where it all started. This is the womb. The womb.
And what's neat for next week is we're actually going to get a chance to go a little bit more into that story too, because we're going to go to the Hauk neighborhood and see a lot of homes that are related to, and you're going to hear some of these same folks come up again, and people related to them, and some new people come up in relation to that. And so, yeah, Pat, thank you so much again for guiding the tour today and sharing everything. And this is awesome because, like I said, earlier when we were getting these all worked out, is these are walking tours virtually for a lot of folks, but it's also a nice way of us to be able to get your oral history of all the stuff about these places. So thank you again. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this feed. Sorry for the little glitch with the feed right off the bat, but it looks like we got it all fixed and we're streaming. And also, please share this with your friends. It's going to be up, so we're not taking these down, so you can share them so more people can hear this history. And we will see you next Friday at noon for our next tour, which will be the Hauk neighborhood. So thanks again, and see you all soon.